The morning of the auction, Nora Calloway braided her youngest daughter's hair by feel, her eyes still fixed on the paper tacked to the post outside the land office across the street. She had read it 3 times already. She did not need to read it again. She knew what it said. Property to be surrendered in satisfaction of outstanding debt. Personal effects and livestock to be auctioned. Saturday, 9 o'clock. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Lena held still while Nora worked the braid, which was not like Lena at all. Lena was 4 years old and had never in her life held still for anything. She was holding still now because she understood, in the way young children understand things they have not been told, that today was not a day for fidgeting. There, Nora said, tying off the braid with a scrap of blue ribbon. The last piece from a bolt she had bought the summer her husband was still alive. You look fine. Lena turned and looked up at her mother with Thomas's eyes, wide-set and dark, the kind of eyes that saw everything and withheld nothing. Will we have a house tonight, Mama? Nora tucked the ribbon end under and did not look away from her daughter's face. We'll have each other, she said. That's what matters. It was the truest thing she could say. She was not certain it was enough. Thomas Calloway had died 14 months ago, in February, on the same day the last of the winter feed ran out. He had ridden to the Granger property in weather that a sensible man would have waited out, because they needed that feed and there was no one else to go for it, and the gelding had broken a leg on ice 2 miles from home. Thomas had walked back in a temperature that did not forgive walking. He had made it to the door. He had not made it much past it. Nora had buried him in the frozen ground on the south side of the property, under the cottonwood he had planted the year they were married, because he said every piece of land needed one old tree, and theirs didn't have one yet. The tree was 11 years old now. It was not old, but it was the tallest thing on the property, and you could see it from the road. And in the months since Thomas died, Nora had developed the habit of looking at it from the kitchen window in the mornings and taking some kind of accounting from the fact that it was still standing. She had 6 children. Joseph was 12, the eldest, solemn and steady in the way that children went solemn and steady when they understood too much too early. Clara was 10, then the twins, Samuel and Ruth, at 8. Daniel was 6. And Lena was 4, who had been born on the coldest night of the year and had been loud and warm and entirely certain of herself ever since. The land itself was sound. 60 acres along Ridgeline Creek, with good bottomland and a reliable water source and soil that Thomas had built up carefully over 11 years. It was not glamorous country, but it was honest country, the kind that rewarded attention. Thomas had given it attention. Nora had given it attention. For 2 seasons after his death, she had managed, pulling the older children into the work in ways that their ages barely allowed, rising before light and going to bed after dark and keeping the arithmetic of survival close in her mind always. But the note on the land had come due in March, and the harvest the previous fall had been thinner than the one before, and the one before that had been thinner than the one before that, because drought did not care that a woman was doing the work of 2 people. She had gone to the bank in Harker's Crossing and spoken to Randall Petch, who was the kind of man who kept his sympathy behind glass and only brought it out when it cost him nothing. He had offered her an extension of 60 days. The 60 days had run out. Nora had written to her sister in Iowa, who had written back that she was sorry and that her husband said there was nothing to be done. She had written to Thomas's brother in Kansas, who had not written back. She had asked, quietly and without the appearance of asking, among the people of Harker's Crossing who might understand what was at stake. Most of them understood. None of them had $60. She had made the children's clothing last the winter by turning cuffs and darning until the darning was the garment and the original fabric was a memory. She had reduced the meals to what the garden and the chickens could produce without the supplement of anything bought. She had sold the second horse and the better of the 2 milk cows and used that money to keep the interest current for 5 months. None of it had been enough. Now she stood on the main street of Harker's Crossing with 6 children ranged around her and the paper on the post that named the date and the hour and the fact of what she had not been able to prevent, and she was trying to decide where, exactly, they would go when the auction was done. The town had turned out for it, not with cruelty. Most of the people of Harker's Crossing were not cruel, but with the particular uncomfortable attention of a community watching something it could not stop and was not sure it should try to stop. since stopping it would require resources no one wanted to volunteer. Nora had dressed the children carefully. She had pressed every garment the night before with the iron and the board Thomas had made for her the first Christmas after their marriage, and each child wore what she had, clean and straight, their hair combed, their boots blacked. She would not go to this day in disorder. Whatever came after, they would face it with their appearance intact. Harlan Petch, Randall's younger brother, was conducting the auction from a flatbed wagon in front of the land office. He was reading from a list in the flat voice of a man performing a task he has performed many times and has made his peace with performing. The livestock went first. The remaining horse, a sorrel mare named Ida that Samuel had been learning to ride on, went for $12 to a rancher from east of town. Nora watched Samuel's face and saw him manage it, the way he pressed his lips together and kept his chin level and looked at the ground for only a moment before bringing his eyes back up. She put her hand on his shoulder, and he let her leave it there. The chickens went for $3 combined, the plow for $4, the tools and lots, the harness, the smokehouse equipment, the stored seed. Each thing called out and sold and gone. Then Harlan Petch cleared his throat and said, "Now the land itself. 60 acres along Ridgeline Creek, good bottom land, creek access, house and outbuildings in fair condition." The bidding started at $35. It moved in small steps, with the particular reluctance of men who wanted the land but were uncertain about the story attached to it. Nora stood with Lena's hand in her left hand and Joseph's shoulder under her right, and she watched the bidding the way you watched weather, without the ability to change it, only to know what it was doing. She did not cry. She had cried in private, in the months of trying, in the nights when the arithmetic would not balance no matter how she arranged it. She had used up that particular reserve, and what remained was something quieter and more durable. She would not give the street of Harker's crossing her grief. That was hers. The bidding had reached $62 and appeared to be settling there when the sound came. Hoofbeats, fast and deliberate, from the north end of the street. The man who rode in was not from Harker's crossing. Nora knew every man in the county, and she did not know this one. He was perhaps 35, broad-shouldered, riding a black horse that was not a working animal but a rancher's horse, well-bred and well-kept. He wore a coat that had seen weather but was not threadbare. He pulled up at the edge of the crowd with the ease of someone accustomed to arriving and having people pay attention to it. He looked at the flatbed wagon. He looked at Harlan Petch. Then, for a moment, he looked at Nora and the 6 children arranged around her, and something moved across his face that was not pity and was not indifference, but was something in between those things that had a different quality than either. "What's the last bid?" he said. 62, Petch said. 110, the man said. The crowd went quiet in the specific way crowds went quiet when something unexpected happened inside a transaction that had seemed settled. Petch looked at him. "Sir, I'll need to see you can make that good." The man reached into his coat and produced a bill of sale or a bank draft. Nora was too far back to see which, and held it up. "That's drawn on the Cheyenne Territorial Bank. Randall Petch can verify it inside. Take 2 minutes." Randall Petch had come out of the land office at the sound of the bidding stalling. He looked at the draft. He looked at the man. He nodded once. "Sold," Petch said, to the gentleman. "If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one." His name was Cole Hargrove. He told her this 40 minutes later, standing on the street while the crowd dispersed and the land office finished its paperwork. He had not immediately approached her after the auction. He had handled the transaction with Petch, spoken briefly with a man Nora did not recognize near the edge of the crowd, and only then walked toward where she stood with the children. He took off his hat when he was still a few feet away. It was a small thing, and she noticed it. "Mrs. Calloway," he said. "My name is Cole Hargrove. I own the Circle H, about 18 miles north of here, past the Elkhorn Creek crossing." "I know the Circle H by reputation," Nora said. She kept her voice even. She was not sure yet what this was. "You run cattle." "Cattle and some horses," he said. "Going on 8 years now." He turned the hat in his hands. He was not a man who was nervous, she could see that, but he was a man who was choosing his words with care, which was a different thing. "I'd like to speak plainly with you, if that's all right." "I prefer it," Nora said. He looked at her directly. He had gray eyes, the kind that did not slide away from what they were looking at. I bought the property, Mrs. Calloway. That's done, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But I bought it for a reason that isn't what you might assume, and I'd like to explain that reason if you'll hear me. Joseph was beside her, and she could feel him listening with his whole body, the way 12-year-old boys listened when they were trying to decide whether someone was trustworthy. Say it, Nora said. Cole Hargrove nodded once. I've been working the Circle H alone for 8 years, he said. I have good land and a sound operation, but I have no family on it. A ranch that size needs more hands than a hired crew. It needs people who have a stake in it. He paused. I knew Thomas Calloway by reputation too, Mrs. Calloway. He was known in this county as a man who built his land up and kept his word. A man who left behind a family like that. He glanced briefly at the children, was building something worth continuing. What are you saying, Mr. Hargrove? Nora said. Not a question, a direction. I'm saying I'd like to offer you and your family a position on the Circle H. Not charity, not a hired hands. Wage for you and the children. A real arrangement, with a house of your own on the property and a share in what the ranch produces. You'd manage the household and the kitchen garden and whatever else your skills suit. The older children would learn ranch work alongside mine. He stopped. Alongside the work. Your land would be held in trust until you're on solid footing, and then we'd renegotiate the arrangement based on what's fair at that point. Nora looked at him for a long moment. She had learned, in 14 months of being alone with 6 children and an operation that required constant decision-making, to read a situation quickly and to trust that reading. There was a version of this offer that was not what it sounded like. There was a version where a widow with 6 children arrived at an isolated ranch and found that the arrangement had conditions that had not been stated plainly on a public street. She looked at Cole Hargrove's face. She looked at the way he held his hat and the way he had stood a few feet back before approaching and the way he was looking at her now, steadily, without the particular quality of a man who was managing something rather than meaning it. You have 8 years on the Circle H, she said. You've made something sound. Why would you take on 6 children you've never met and a woman you don't know? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something she had not expected. Because I had a mother who was a widow in Kansas with 4 children, he said. And no one offered her anything. And I have had to live with what that cost her for 20 years. I am not saying it as an excuse or a claim on your gratitude. I'm saying it so you understand that this offer comes from somewhere real. Clara, who was 10 years old and had her mother's directness, looked up at Cole Hargrove and said, Do you have animals on your ranch? He looked down at her with an expression that was not performing warmth but contained it. Cattle and horses and 2 dogs, and a barn cat that doesn't earn its keep, he said. Do the dogs bite? Clara asked. Not unless you give them reason, he said. Clara looked at her mother with the look that said she had gathered her information and made her assessment. Nora had learned to trust Clara's assessments. Can I have a day to think on it? Nora said. Take 2, Cole Hargrove said. He produced a card from his coat pocket and held it out. Send word to the post office in Kerrigan when you're ready. If the answer is no, I'll hold the deed here in Harker's Crossing until you can find another arrangement. I'm not turning you out of your house while you're deciding. Nora took the card. She looked at it. She looked at him. Why didn't you just give me the money? She said. That would have been simpler. Something shifted in his expression, a slight movement around the eyes. Because you'd have had to take it as charity and pay it back as charity, and I've watched proud people break under that particular kind of arrangement. What I'm offering is a transaction. You bring skill and family and work. The Circle H gives you stability and share. No one is beholden. Nora put the card in her pocket. She did not take 2 days. She took 1. She spent that day walking the house Thomas had built, the rooms they had lived in, the kitchen where she had cooked 10,000 meals, the bedroom where 6 children had been born in the good years and the hard years both. She spent it looking at the cottonwood through the kitchen window and having, in the privacy of her own mind, the conversation she would have had with Thomas if Thomas had still been there to have it. She knew what he would have said. Thomas Calloway had been a practical man who loved his family too practically to let sentiment stand between them and safety. He would have said, take the arrangement. He would have said you can build something anywhere if the foundation is sound. He would have said the cottonwood is in the ground. Nora, it'll be here when you come back. She sent the word to Kerrigan the next morning. The Circle H was larger than she had imagined from the road, which she had only passed once, years ago, when she and Thomas had driven south to the county seat. There was a main house, solid and square with good windows and a porch she could already see would catch the afternoon light. There was a second house, smaller, set back from the main one by 100 yards, with its own garden plot and a view of the western hills. This was the house Cole Hargrove had told her would be theirs. He met them on the road into the property and rode alongside the wagon for the last quarter-mile, pointing out the water situation and the location of the outbuildings, and answering the children's questions with a patience that suggested he had either been around children or had thought carefully about what this arrival would require. The house had been cleaned. Not recently cleaned. Cleaned specifically for them. Nora could tell. The floors swept close and the windows washed, and a stack of firewood beside the stove that was fresh split. Someone had placed a jug of dried wildflowers on the table. They were not artful. They were earnest. Lena went immediately to the jug and examined the flowers with the focused attention she brought to everything. "Who put these here?" she asked. "I did," Cole Hargrove said from the doorway. He said it without apparent embarrassment. Lena considered this. "They're nice," she said. "They were the best ones I could find in November," he said. Lena accepted this as sufficient and moved on to investigating the rest of the house. The first weeks were careful and orderly, two people feeling out the shape of an arrangement, keeping to its stated terms, establishing what was expected and what was not. Nora organized the household and the kitchen garden, which had been neglected since the last hired family had left in August. She took stock of what the main house kitchen needed and made a list and gave it to Cole without ceremony. And he came back from town 3 days later with most of it and an explanation for the two things he hadn't been able to source. She organized the older children's work so that Joseph and Clara learned the ranch work alongside Cole's hands, and the younger ones helped with the kitchen garden and the chickens and the smaller tasks that children could do with instruction and supervision. Cole Hargrove was a man of routine. She learned this quickly. He rose before light and was in the barn by the time she had the stove going. He came to the main house for meals and ate them with the focused quiet of someone who had eaten alone for a long time and had not entirely adjusted to eating otherwise. He spoke to the children directly, not through her, which she noted. He answered their questions with the same quality of attention he brought to everything complete, considered, not abbreviated. He did not make overtures. He did not press against the terms of the arrangement. He kept to the side of the line that had been drawn on that street in Harker's Crossing, the professional line, the business line, and he kept to it consistently, without the quality of a man keeping to it with effort. She watched this for 6 weeks before she decided that it was not performance. It was February when the weather broke hard, earlier than anyone had expected, a 3-day storm that pushed snow up against the south side of every structure on the property and dropped the temperature to the kind of number that made the air sharp and wrong feeling. The cattle had to be moved into the lower pasture where the windbreak was better, which required all the hands and most of a day in conditions that were genuinely dangerous. Cole had not asked her to help. She had come anyway. She had left Lena and Daniel with Clara, who was 10 and capable, and she had put on the heaviest coat and the good boots and gone out to where the men were working the cattle through the gate, because there were 600 head and 4 sets of hands, and the math did not work. She took a position at the far end of the line and worked it for 4 hours in the cold until the last animal was through and the gate was closed and everyone was out of the weather. Cole had not said anything when he saw her come out. He had simply nodded once and pointed to where the gap in the line was. In the barn afterward, warming their hands at the small stove the hands used in winter, he said, "You didn't have to do that." "I know," she said. The arithmetic was wrong. He looked at her with the gray eyes that did not look away from things. "You can always see the arithmetic. Thomas said it was my most useful quality," she said, "and also occasionally my most annoying one." Something eased in his expression that she had not seen ease before. Not a smile, exactly, but the thing that came before one. He was probably right on both counts, Cole said. Nora looked at her hands, still red from the cold, the same hands that had braided Lena's hair on the morning of the auction in Harker's Crossing. The same hands that had kept the accounts and the garden and the 6 children and the operation for 14 months by force of will and habit and the stubborn refusal to let the arithmetic defeat her. He was usually right, she said. It was one of his better qualities. They stood in the small barn warmth for a moment without speaking. Outside the storm was still going, the particular Wyoming sound of wind that had decided to make a point. "Mrs. Calloway," Cole said. He stopped. He started again. Nora. He said it carefully, the way you said something for the first time. I want to say something to you, and I want to say it plainly, the way we've been talking to each other from the start. She looked at him and waited. This arrangement we made in Harker's Crossing, he said. I meant every word of it. I mean every word of it still. You and the children have a place here as long as you want one, on exactly the terms we agreed, and nothing I'm about to say changes that or adds conditions to it. He was choosing every word with the same care he brought to everything. But I would be dishonest if I didn't tell you that what I feel when you walk into a room has moved a considerable distance past what a business arrangement explains. Nora said nothing. I'm not asking you for anything, Cole said. I'm not changing the terms. I'm just telling you the truth, because I've found that I can't be around you and be less than honest, and leaving that unsaid feels like a kind of dishonesty. He turned his hat in his hands, the same gesture she had noticed on that street in November. That's all. Nora looked at the barn wall for a moment. She thought about the card in her pocket. She thought about the dried wildflowers in the jug, which were still on the table in her house, because Lena had declared them fine and Nora had not moved them. She thought about the way Cole Hargrove spoke to her children, directly and without condescension, treating them as people whose thoughts were worth asking after. She thought about Thomas. She thought about the cottonwood. You're a careful man, she said. I try to be, he said. You were careful on that street, she said. You came from the right distance back. You took your hat off. You looked at me and not past me. She paused. You'd thought about it before you arrived. He was quiet for a moment. I'd ridden by the land office the 2 Saturdays before the auction, he said. I'd heard about the situation. I thought about whether it was my business for a long time before I decided it was. Why did you decide it was? Because no one else was going to, he said. And because I could. And because the way you were standing on that street with those 6 children. He stopped. You didn't look beaten. You looked like a person deciding what came next. That's different from beaten, and most people couldn't see the difference. Nora was quiet. I could, he said, because I'd seen my mother stand the same way. Outside, the storm continued its Wyoming argument with the landscape, and in the barn the small stove worked against the cold, and Nora Calloway stood in the warmth of it and looked at a man who had ridden into Harker's Crossing with a bank draft and a plan and the particular quality of someone who had thought hard about what a person needed before he offered it. I'm not ready for anything, she said. I want to be honest with you the same way you've been honest with me. Thomas has been gone 14 months, and I am not finished grieving him, and I don't know when I will be. I'm not asking you to be, Cole said. I know, she said. That's why I'm telling you. She looked at him steadily. I'm telling you because I don't want to leave that unsaid either. The spring came slowly to the Circle H, the way it always came to Wyoming, grudgingly at first, a degree warmer each week, the ground softening in small increments. Nora expanded the kitchen garden in March, adding 2 rows of vegetables that the property's soil was well suited for, and Cole watched her measure the plot and plan the rows with the same expression he brought to watching her do anything that required systematic thought. It was the expression of a man taking account of something. Joseph had taken to the ranch work the way some boys took to things that were too large for them and grew into the size of them quickly. He had a gift with the horses, a steadiness around them that the animals responded to, and one of Cole's senior hands had said to Cole, within Joseph's hearing, that the boy was a natural, which Joseph had received with a care that suggested he would be thinking about it for a long time. Clara helped Nora with the garden and with the younger ones and with the general management of the second house. She had her mother's competence and her father's quietness, and she was developing opinions about ranch work that she delivered at the dinner table with a precision that occasionally silenced the adults. Cole had begun asking for her opinions on things she had observed, and she gave them to him with the seriousness of someone whose thoughts had been asked for before and understood to be worth having. The twins, Samuel and Ruth, had found their territory in the barn and the chickens and the spaces between the structures where children built the quiet private world of 2 children who had always had each other. Daniel had attached himself to Cole's youngest hand, a laconic man of 25 named Pete who knew the land south of the Elkhorn Creek better than anyone and was willing to show what he knew to a 6-year-old who asked. Lena remained Lena, which meant she was everywhere and into everything and deeply certain that her presence was welcome in any room at any time, which, in this household, it was. They had settled into the shape of a life. Nora knew this the way she knew most things, practically and without ceremony, by noticing one morning in April that she had gone through an entire day without calculating what she would do if it fell apart. The arithmetic had become normal arithmetic, the arithmetic of a working operation, not the arithmetic of survival. She did not make a monument of it. She simply noted it. The conversation she had been waiting to have found its moment on a Sunday evening in May, when the older children were doing their schoolwork in the lamplight of their house, and Lena was asleep, and the evening had gone quiet in the particular way of spring evenings when the ground has finally made its peace with warmth. She walked to the main house. Cole was on the porch, which was where he was most evenings, not doing anything specific, just being there in the way of a man whose day's work was done and who had learned to inhabit a quiet evening. He stood up when he saw her coming. She sat in the other chair, the one she had taken to sitting in on the evenings she came to the porch, which had started once a week and had become most evenings without either of them marking the transition. "I've been thinking about what you said in February," she said. "I know," he said. He said it without presumption, simply as the truth. "Thomas was the kind of man you built a life around," she said. "Not because he required it. Because he was worth it. Because the life you built around him was a good one." She looked at the dark hills in the distance, the last of the evening light still holding at the edge of them. "I spent 14 months trying to hold on to the life we built. I don't think that was wrong. I think it was what I had to do." She paused. "But I've been watching you for 6 months, Cole. I've watched you with my children. I've watched you work. I've watched you do the thing you said on that street, the thing where you offer something without conditions attached." He was listening the way he always listened, completely and without interruption. "You're a good man," she said. "You're patient and you're honest and you're kind to my children in a way that doesn't perform itself." She looked at him. "I'm not finished grieving, Thomas. I want to be plain about that. But I've learned that grief and love are not in competition with each other, and that a woman can hold both without one diminishing the other." "Cole." Hargrove looked at her across the porch with the gray eyes she had come to read with some accuracy, and he said, "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" "I'm saying," Nora said carefully, "that I'm willing to see what this becomes, if you still want to find out." He was quiet for a moment with the quality of someone who had been waiting for something long enough that when it arrived, he needed a moment to be sure it was real. "I still want to find out," he said. She nodded once. "Then let's find out slowly," she said. "In the right order. The children need to know you first, not as a business arrangement, but as a person they've chosen to trust. That matters." "It matters to me too," he said. "I know it does," she said. "That's why I'm here." They sat on the porch as the last light went from the hills and the stars came out over Wyoming, enormous and indifferent and magnificent, and neither of them said very much more that evening. They did not need to. The important thing had been said plainly, in the way they had said everything from the beginning, and what came next would come at the right pace, and in the right order, and with the full knowledge of what it was. The word came out of Harker's crossing in June, the way words came out of small towns, in pieces and through multiple mouths, and arriving at its destination slightly larger than it had started. What had happened at the auction in November, what Cole Hargrove had done and why, and what had developed at the Circle H since then, all of it traveled the county roads, and arrived at tables, and over fences, and in the general store on Main Street, where Randall Petch heard it, and was said to have gone quiet in a way he was not typically quiet. It was not the auction that people talked about most, in the end. It was the smaller things. The dried wildflowers in the jug that Lena had declared fine. The afternoon Cole had ridden into Harker's crossing with Joseph at his side to conduct some business at the land office, and the way he had introduced the boy to the men they encountered, not as the widow Calloway's son or the boy staying at the Circle H, but as Joseph, who is good with horses and learning the trade. It was the way Samuel and Ruth had shown up at the spring gathering with their mother and stood close to Cole without appearing to have arranged it. The way children stood close to someone when they had decided that person was safe. It was the way Nora Calloway, who had stood on the street of Harker's crossing in November with 6 children, and the particular expression of a woman who has decided what came next without knowing yet what it was, stood at the Circle H spring gathering in June with the expression of a woman who had already found it. Margaret Doyle, who kept the dry goods store and had known Nora since she'd come to the county with Thomas 11 years before, said to her that afternoon, "You look like yourself again." Nora considered this. "I look like someone new," she said. "But she's made of the same things." Cole and Nora were married in late August at the Circle H, which was the right place for it. The ceremony was plain and the guests were few and the children were present for every moment of it, which was what mattered. Joseph stood beside Cole. Clara stood beside Nora. The twins sat with Daniel and Lena in the front row, Lena wearing the good blue ribbon in her hair, the last piece from the bolt Thomas had bought, which Nora had kept through the auction and the moving and the 6 months at the Circle H, and which seemed right to use now, on a day that deserved a ribbon. The minister asked the words and both of them said them clearly and without hesitation, and when it was done Cole turned to Nora with the gray eyes that had been looking at her directly since November and said, quietly, just to her, "Thank you for staying." "You came to me on a road," Nora said. "That's not staying. That's arriving." "Same thing," he said. She thought about that for a moment and decided he was right. The Circle H continued to grow in the years that followed, slowly and soundly, the way things grown with proper attention grew. Cole expanded the herd and the horse operation both, and he did it with the input of a family that had stake in the outcome, the older children learning the decisions as they grew into the capacity to make them, the younger ones coming up in the knowledge that work was what a family did together and the land was what a family built together. Joseph became, by the time he was 17, one of the best horsemen in the county. This was not said by Cole, who was careful not to claim credit for what the boy had made of himself. It was said by Pete, the hand who had taught Daniel to read the land south of the Elkhorn Creek, who was not a man who said things for effect. Clara went east to study and came back to the Circle H with a trained mind and a direct manner of speaking that had always been there, but had found its full scope in the years of education. She brought back ideas about land management that she argued for at the dinner table with the precision of 10-year-old Clara arguing observations at supper, only larger, and Cole listened to her the way he had always listened, completely and without dismissal. The twins built their own things in their own ways, Samuel with the animals and Ruth with the accounts, two people who had always been two people and had never required anything to be otherwise. Daniel learned the land the way he had always meant to, the creek crossings and the seasonal patterns and the places the birds came back to, and used that knowledge in ways that made the ranch better, quietly and without announcement. Lena grew up certain of herself, which was not a surprise. She had been born that way. She grew up also with a capacity for warmth that she did not constrain, the kind of warmth that came from growing up in a household where warmth was both given and received, and no one made you feel it was too much. Nora watched all of it from the vantage of a woman who had stood on a street in November and decided what came next without knowing what it was. She watched it with the accounting mind that Thomas had called her most useful quality, and she kept the count of what the Circle H had become from what it had been, and the number that came out of that accounting was not a money number, but a life number, the kind that took years to arrive at and could not be shortened and could not be bought. She thought about Thomas. She thought about him often and without diminishment, and she believed he knew the accounting of what she had built, because he had been a practical man who loved his family practically, and practical love understood that continuation was its own form of fidelity. She thought about Cole, who had ridden into Harker's crossing on a November morning and produced a bank draft and taken his hat off before he spoke to her, and who had said what he meant from the first moment and gone on saying it every day since. She thought about Lena on the morning of the auction, holding still in the way Lena never held still, asking if they would have a house tonight, and Nora saying, "We'll have each other. That's what matters." She had been right. It had been enough. And what they had now was not in place of what they'd had before. It was built from the same material, the same stubbornness and love and practical attention, the same willingness to stay when the arithmetic was hard and to trust that the foundation, if laid with care, would hold. It had held. That was the whole of it. A woman who kept the count of what mattered, and a man who knew how to look at someone standing on a road and see past the surface of what they were carrying to the person doing the carrying. And 6 children who had been wanted by nobody except the people who knew what they were and who they belonged to, and who grew up knowing it, and who built their lives on it. That knowledge, passed down through the hands that did the work and the voices that told the story and the land that held the memory of all of it, was the thing that lasted. It was the thing that always lasted. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.